dear Ainsworth Rance Bufford. Look at where we are. Your old stomping grounds. You knew this building as both the Capitol and the Congressional Library. You were 39 years old when the 16th President, Abraham Lincoln, appointed you the 6th Librarian of Congress in 1864. You went on to serve 9 more administrations. The room in which you worked, and I found it hard to spot with my modern eyes, had no artificial light. You worked until it got dark. Edison and his team provided the world with illumination, but also played another role in your life, whether you knew it or not. And that is how your story connects to mine. Just a little while ago, the Copyright Office celebrated the 40 millionth copyright registration in the US. The original Barbie, for instance, lives up here somewhere. I wonder what you would say to all of this today. It is nearly 130 years ago that the first 5 deposits came in of what we now know as motion pictures. And as the de facto register of copyrights, as that job didn't exist yet, you signed off on all of them. Today, we have deposit materials left of only 2 of them. I am going to tell you a story about what it's like to do history from where I am standing. It is a story about commodification and the creation of value. It is a story about resistance and perseverance. And it is a story about survival and loss. What survives is some of your copyright correspondence and that duo of deposits. But what is lost is harder to ascertain. And although other people's letterbooks survive, yours, for instance, for 10 tumultuous years in the history of the library, which could have given us unimaginable insights, are lost. I benefit from the beauty of hindsight, so not all is lost. I know where the story is going, using a concept from one of your contemporaries, Joseph Conrad, the shadow line. The line that you know you have crossed once you have crossed it and can look back over it. Like the transition from adolescence to adulthood, like the equator, and in your case, like the emergence of cinema. Edison initially was doubtful whether there was any commercial feature in his invention and thought of his device as a mere toy, which was of too sentimental a character to get the public to invest in. I now know cinema, as one critic termed it, as the most powerful empathy machine in all of the arts. So as we'll see, hindsight can be 20/20, but it can also be blinding. Some of the dots were easy to connect looking backwards, but some of the other connections have been assigned so much meaning over time that they were hard to untie. I came here looking for you, looking for those connections between me going about my day, researching you going about yours. Your surviving documents have shown me a part of your world, and if you come with me in my DeLorean time machine, I'll show you how they are a part of mine. You had one singular vision, Ainsworth, and that was to build the ultimate collection of American culture, including both failures and successes. You didn't have enough appropriation, though, to just go out and buy more books for the collection. So partially because of the building in which you worked and the people in it whom you knew well, you thought of a genius solution. You advocated for the passing of the 1870 Copyright Act, and you argued that if both legally required best edition copies were mailed to Washington directly, the copyright records and the publications to which they pertained would be stored together. One copy would be for the deposit, and like that, you would know the number of copyright publications, which could prevent them from being invalidated, and the other was for growing the collection. And grow it did. The collection grew so explosively that very quickly you had, as he's beautifully termed it before Congress, a want of room and a want of hands. And so you started advocating for 2 more things. The want of room became this building across the street, the one that you knew as the Library of Congress and that I now know as the Jefferson Building, and where for the past few months I have been privileged to spend a lot of time thinking about your work. You were a big fan of the third president, so you would have loved it that they called it the Jefferson. If a move like the one you instigated 125 years ago from the Capitol to the Jefferson would happen today, everybody would show up with their phones to snap pictures and document the event. I don't expect you to understand that sentence, but what I would give to see images of you guys allegedly build chutes out of the Capitol windows, slide down all the material, move it across in horse-drawn carts, only to rearrange it all again here on the other side of the street. While in the Capitol, you must have felt pressured in so many different directions. You tried to answer questions from congressmen, from patrons, create a silent environment for reading and study, but you also tried to grow the collection and deal with all sorts of copyright registrations coming in. And you've regularly complained of needing help. The move across the street into a dedicated building coincided with your want of hands finally leading to the splitting of your job in two. John Russell Young takes over from you as the Librarian of Congress, and Thorvald Solberg, who had been your assistant a few decades earlier, and who, just like you, was also not a lawyer, became the first official and longest-serving Register of Copyrights in the newly founded U.S. Copyright Office in 1897. You initially stayed behind in the Capitol, from then on called the Old Library, before taking up the post of Assistant Librarian in the Jefferson Building. This new abode ended up overflowing quicker than you could have imagined, and so the want of room never really stopped. Want of room and want of hands is probably the best definition of a repository altogether I can think of. First, the annex, now the Adams Building, was added in the 1930s, followed by the Madison Building in the 1980s. Incidentally, all buildings at some point home to the U.S. Copyright Office, with a never-ending want of room. Let's go back to the Capitol for a moment, to 1893. Between the middle of that year and the end of 1894, you take in 5 copyright deposits by W. K.L. Dixon, head of the Moving Picture Department at Edison in New Jersey. I single them out here, although Dixon had been registering photos with you for a while, as these 5 are special. They represent the end of chronophotography, popularized by Muybridge and others, but also represent the beginning of something new, a whole new cultural branch, perhaps the most American of them all, the movies. To give you some perspective, Top Gun Maverick, this summer's so-called blockbuster, has just surpassed $1 billion at the box office. And I wonder if that is even fathomable to you. These 5 registrations represent an interesting separate group of work, as paradoxically there is quite a substantial gap after these, from late 1894 till late 1896, during which no registrations for motion pictures by anyone come in. I say paradoxically, as we generally now see 1895 in the middle of that gap as the year in which cinema was invented, which in itself speaks to the rather complicated nature of the process of invention and innovation and the arbitrary lines we draw in it. But here is what is interesting. Only 3 of these 5 are identified, and of only 2 of those do we have deposit materials left. Number 5 is the Corbett-Courtney fight, of which we only have a film copy that was later acquired for the library's collection. The 2 for which we do have deposit materials are number 4, the Sandow souvenir strip, and quite literally a souvenir that people took home from the trade show that first showcased the machine that displays these images, the kinetoscope. And number 2, now known as Fredot's sneeze, and arguably the most famous of them all, as over time it has come to take the place of the missing first. The story repeated in many places usually goes a bit like this. The earliest identifiable material submitted for the copyright of a moving picture is this kinetoscopic record of Fredot, an Edison employee, sneezing. Earlier materials were submitted for the same purpose, but their identity remains unknown. This sequence had to be registered in still print form because the copyright law did not provide for motion pictures until 1912. And although some of that info is technically true, I have wondered about this story for a while. This is the Library of Congress, the best, the biggest, the beacon. This is the home of copyright, the home of the importance of it, and the home of where it intersects with the emergence of new technologies. These records were created on the inside of this institution. What happened? What were these others? What was this so-called first, or the third? Why are they unidentified? Why are they lost? In the telling of history, we create imagined points of origin. Stories get flattened and made less complicated. We believe the oft-repeated story to such an extent that we might forget that there are other stories to tell. So rather than look at the scenario from a vantage point that exclusively takes into consideration what the movies later became, I decided to look at the copyright side of things and what you were doing at the time. To register works, you used a practical translation of the law with directions for how to secure copyrights. Later, there would be standardized forms, but at this time, applications for copyright came in as letters, some 75,000 letters annually, cover letters from people, claimants, asking for copyright, typically accompanied by a title page and 2 best edition copies of the creative work they wanted to register. Although some people definitely thought and even wrote you that you needed to take in everything that they send you, you didn't. The registration process was not automatic. You and your team opened up the mail, which came in several times a day, and initially decided whether the application fitted within the 15 or so existing categories of what was copyrightable. Books, for instance, were solidly on that list. Blank forms, however, as a case some 15 years earlier had decided, were not. Let's look at some of these directions. The printed title could be a copy of the title page if the publication had one. Otherwise, it had to be printed expressly for copyright entry. A separate title was required for each entry. The fee was 50 cents, and if you wanted a certificate mailed to you, that would cost an additional 50 cents. Copyright could be for an expected work, but no later than the day of publication, 2 completed copies needed to be deposited in the mail to so-called perfect the copyright. And without the deposit of copies, the copyright was void, and a penalty of $25 was incurred. No copyright was valid unless notice was given, and the law imposed a penalty of $100 if you used a notice while you hadn't obtained the copyright. For books published in more volumes or photographs with variations, a copyright had to be entered for each variety, and to complete that copyright, 2 copies of each part had to be deposited. Generally, registering one category of work as another was nothing out of the ordinary for you. Sculptures, for instance, were deposited as photographs all the time. But look at this. This one is perhaps the real trip. You signed off on the copyright registration for the Statue of Liberty. And that certainly didn't come in as 2 copies of the statue. What did come in was a photograph of the model and a drawing of what the Statue of American Independence, as it was called in the registration, would look like were it to be erected, which took another 10 years, as this was indeed a prospective registration. You followed the specific directions pragmatically, and typically, if you found anything at fault, you would reject the application and return it to the claimant, sometimes with precise instructions for resubmission. And because they were sent back, we now have very little evidence of the problem cases and rejections. A small collection, however, that survives of this so-called unfinished business, some 30 boxes full of questions, complaints, and rejections in process, such as an attempt to register the numbers of the months, show tremendous insights into what you were doing. And people ask you so many questions. This won't mean much to you, but you seem to have been at Google before there was a Google. On the 16th of August, 1893, 3 applications for copyright come in by W.K.L. Dixon. 2 get registered right away. There seems to be no problem. They are 2 portraits of Edison taken by Dixon, number 1 and number 2. The registrations in book number 19 for that year list 2 copies of each, registered as a photograph. We have the title pages and the deposits. The third one seems to cause some confusion. Despite also coming in on the 16th of August, it does not enter registration book number 23 until the 6th of October of that year, where we can see some of that confusion play out. 2 specific things about this entry have been puzzling us in our historic distance ever since. First of all, the category is listed as book or form, which is a highly unusual entry. And as we saw from your directions, book was copyrightable subject matter, whereas form was not. In the same time frame, amongst tens of thousands of documents, I have seen this entry on only one other occasion, on a letter from indeed those unfinished business boxes, or form added in your handwriting to the stamped book. The other puzzling element is the title, Edison Kinetoscopic Records, because what we have been wondering is which records, which precise film titles are hiding behind this larger umbrella term. 2 copies of something come in on the 16th of August and 2 more on the 6th of October, to which is added different photos. All of these deposits are currently unlocatable. You compiled entries, Ainsworth, entries of registered titles for the Secretary of the Treasury, who in turn would publish on a weekly basis the catalogue of title entries, entries for which the copyright had been completed by the deposit of 2 copies, mostly to distribute to places receiving foreign mail so that the import of foreign copies could be inhibited. A few days after the 6th of October, number 118 of that publication lists Edison Kinetoscope Records under the heading of photographs. At the beginning of the following year, our sneezing Fred comes in. Edison Kinetoscopic Record of a Sneeze, January 7th, 1894. We have Dixon's application letter with his extraordinary penmanship, and nothing seems to be the matter. We have the 2 stamp deposit copies left, registered as a photograph. In April of 1894, we see the registration of another Edison Kinetoscopic Records, and again, we have wondered which records are hiding behind this entry. 2 copies come in, registered as a photograph, this time with the written addition of unalike. We only have Dixon's letter left. In May, then, we find the 4th, the souvenir strip of the Edison kinetoscope, and in November, we see the 5th, Corbett and Courtney before the kinetograph, all registered as a photograph. But this time, surprisingly named for the camera that shot the images to kinetograph, rather than the kinetoscope with which to view them. From the registration, we only have this title page left, and the name of Edison is gone from the title. So overall, quite some confusion and quite some materials missing for what we now think is the beginning of cinema. The movies have messed with my generation's sense of doing history, Ainsworth. They have taught us that if you keep at it for long enough, you will find the historic treasure that you're after, and that it comes beautifully wrapped up in some greater and deeper insight. I came here with expectations of stitching the story back together that were nothing short of extraordinary, but I wasn't quite prepared for the physical experience of being here. This collection is so vast in ways that I don't think I understood until I felt how small I was in these buildings. And at times, wandering these halls has felt like wandering through a maze. Something shifted in me, though, when I realized about a third into my fellowship that, just like in a maze, getting lost, going down roads that don't necessarily lead anywhere, getting stuck, but then taking another path and getting unstuck are all necessary parts of the research journey. I needed to embrace that feeling lost and let sheer serendipity, their surviving documents, the buildings, and the people in it guide me in telling my story. And how I love being in this building. Going down these corner spiral staircases is exciting. Every time it makes me think of this glorious shot. The dynamic camera movement says everything you need to know about Robert Redford's character. You don't know who Robert Redford is. He is one of the greats. But he knows who you are. Here he is in one of his other movies about a political scandal involving the 37th president, coming up to the Library of Congress to figure out a piece of his quest. And look, there you are, Ainsworth, on the wall behind him. Your beloved building will soon celebrate its 125th anniversary. I can only imagine what you would think of it, but it has functioned on many occasions as a filming location, almost exclusively in that magnificent room that takes my breath away every time I walk in, the main reading room. The lead character in this film likes to enrich herself by reading, which is certainly something you would have approved of. In the remake of the film, however, and I have to tell you about the cultural phenomenon of remakes some other time, they have the same character do something of which you certainly would not. The idea of a library and the hidden treasures that can be found there seems to be the focus of many of the films set in this room. Here is Nicolas Cage about to find an uncatalogued secret diary written by all the presidents. Once you know the place pretty well, and if you look closely at the shot, you see how fictional the set dressing is of one of the balconies in your beloved rotunda. Or this one, in which both the stacks and the card catalogue are used as a conduit for spies bringing additional things in, a big no-no today. Although one of the most frustrating things to a researcher is the answer not on shelf, the catalogue to an institution like this, with precise locations so that items can easily be retrieved, is everything. And here is one of your most famous colleague librarians practically saying the same.
If an item does not appear in our records, it does not exist.
And so, yeah, what was I looking for? Perhaps something that did not exist. On the one hand, I was looking for the thing. Like, what if I could actually find the first? But I was also looking for the conversation. Dixon did not do this by himself. I was convinced he must have had conversations with you, asking you lots of questions, Where to start? I thought that the Spofford papers seemed like a great idea, but to see your private papers reduced to 2 microfilm reels made me sad for longer than was healthy. And I forgot about having to decipher handwriting. This was going to be hard. But then a guardian angel told me that if this had been logical, someone else would have done it. Copyright is the foundational building block of this institution, and so I quickly realized that your professional papers cut across everything. They sit everywhere, in almost every division. And if this were a movie, this is where it would cue the so-called training montage. I followed the files, I followed the films, and I followed other people's footnotes. I read up on the institutional history of multiple moves and the merging and splitting of divisions, traced not only the deposits and practical processes from building to building through cellars and attics, but I also started digging to find out where some of the remains of all your paperwork sit, some of it indeed uncatalogued. Reading rooms, finding aids, accession numbers, conversations with librarians and curators, many conversations with retired library employees who all graciously shared their insights, which ultimately led me to a collection of pallets. The silver lining of waiting to get access to unprocessed material for 4 months was that I was gaining insights that I didn't know I needed. I didn't know how comfortable the difference between title page, copyright correspondence, and deposit would become to me. Insights I was going to need. In the meantime, I decided to visit the other end of your conversation, the Edison Archive in New Jersey. I wonder if you ever made it out there, as your son Charles worked for Edison. There's a lot of material in the archive, as the plant was so fundamental to so many other groundbreaking inventions, it's astonishing. But the sad news is that the plant suffered from an all too common contingency of history, a devastating fire in 1914, which shockingly only claimed 1 life, of someone who ran back in for their personal belongings. The fire started in the film inspection department. A contemporaneous report states that the source was a can, 6.5 inch in diameter and 10 inch in height, used to store film, and that the source of the combustion was never identified. A can of nitrate film, and who knows, perhaps the spark of a cigarette. More than half of the 22 buildings were destroyed, and although some motion picture materials survive, most of the early materials were wiped. They picked themselves up by their bootstraps quicker than we can imagine, immediately started rebuilding, and a few months later were in business again. An archive is not an unmediated repository of access to the past, Ainsworth, and every trace of a conversation with you is gone. You and your team must have perfectly understood which precise works were hiding behind some of these copyright titles, but over time we have lost that institutional knowledge. In the late 1930s, the Copyright Office moves from the Jefferson Building to the newly completed annex, occupying the entire first floor by then. The records stored in the cellar of the Jefferson Building move as well. In this transition, a keen employee of the Copyright Office, Howard Walls, develops an interest in what has become known as the paper print collection. Some 3,000 of the earliest motion pictures registered as photographs as rolls of paper. This interest leads to the greatest revival activity of the silent cinema era, during which these paper prints are restored back to film and, amongst other things, become a treasure trove for reuse by the greatest names in American avant-garde. But let's go to 1943, when a few things occur. The romantic reading is that it's the 50th anniversary of that very first deposit. The more likely reading is that the Copyright Office packs up shop and vacates its premises to make room for the war relief effort. A World War Ainsworth II. Many copyright holdings get stored at the National Archives temporarily, and important registrations get pulled out. What we have left today for both kinetoscopic records is these so-called transfer memos, charge-out letters, relics in themselves by now, signed for by a high-ranking library official, which were used as placeholders for the title pages. It is not clear what happens in the ensuing 10 years, but at a press conference in November 1953, at which the library, collaborating with the Academy, announces the restoration of the paper prints, the kinetoscopic records are gone. It is announced that Edison received the first copyright for a motion picture in 1894 for The Sneeze. Edison, Dixon, Fred Odd, and you are dead by then, so this information isn't rectified. It's kind of funny that motion picture is in quotation marks, as that's exactly how we would use those today. Because were they? None of our first 5 are actually on the program, not even The Sneeze. That fame is created later. These deposits became motion pictures in the 1950s. In the 1890s, they were photographs coming in as photographs. So many films were being produced at the Edison plant, but Dixon only registered a handful. And although today we might think of them as projectable motion pictures, Dixon registered for copyright only those that initially had some other function, such as in The Sneeze's case, publication in Harper's Weekly. My attempts today build on all previous attempts to crack this story, and sometimes it's very hard to go against the prevalent story. But I have new ways of looking for things, Ainsworth. My gosh, digitization alone. What I am looking for, where I am looking for it, and how have all changed from the people who came before me. And so in comparing what was made with what was registered, I came across a publication from 1894 with particularly interesting credits. What I didn't realize at the time is that I was holding part of the so-called smoking gun. You were known for your elephantine memory, Ainsworth. You allegedly led the author of Ben-Hur to an apt description of chariot racing in a bookstore in Boston. I like to think that you could have led me to the box in question without any problem. But no, I had to puzzle it together for myself. And with the help of many guardian angels along the way, one early morning, late June, in the Virginia countryside, there it was, that extraordinary penmanship, sitting exactly where it was supposed to sit. To use the words of Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, a historical detail suddenly gave me the feeling of an immediate contact with the past, a sensation as deep as the purest enjoyment of art, of experiencing truth through history. And although they are his words, they exactly describe my feelings when I first saw this letter. My eyes were flicking back and forth between the date of November 1893, which made no connection in my brain, and the sample that fell out. I realized immediately that this was both the thing and the conversation, and it all hinged on a linguistic shift in order to make a conceptual one. Dixon says in his letter, now that I have my one copyright of kinetoscopic subjects, while the back of the sample reads, sample sent last for copyright, Edison Kinetoscopic Records. he did not mean records as referring to a multitude of different titles, as we have interpreted this word in our historic distance, but he refers to it as to a multitude of images. And checking various credits to his publications confirms that he uses the plural all the time for what we now see as one thing. Kinetoscopic views, kinetoscopic pictures, kinetoscopic records. You had, of course, done this before. You understood that multiple images could be registered as one. Muybridge had done so already with you in the 1870s. And the idea that Edison Kinetoscopic Records is only one title makes complete sense with everything else you were doing, as a separate title would have been required for each entry. We have no other example of a multitude of titles registered as one in the 19th century. These so-called group registrations don't come in until the late 20th century. If anything, you would have seen that as fee evasion. The letter also made me laugh out loud. Dixon says in this letter, "If my last copyright wasn't correct, please inform me and I will make out another wording." We see this as the beginning of cinema, but he hasn't even heard back from you. He was stingy. He only took the 50-cent registrations until he realized that he wouldn't hear back from you unless he'd take out the $1 one so that he'd receive a certificate. And you know what, Ainsworth? His stinginess confirms something else. He just wouldn't have risked a $100 fine for a copyright he didn't have, as it only cost him 50 cents to get one. And indeed, we only have examples of Dixon credits that were solid. We have no example of any credit for which Dixon claims to have copyright that he had not. None. It all seems to fit. This amateur gymnast number 2 hadn't been shot yet when Dixon sent you his letter. So that is registration number 3. Fred Odd is still number 2, which means that the first Edison Kinetoscopic Records is now identified, as they called it at the Edison plant, as the blacksmith shop. Except for the extraordinary penmanship, Ainsworth, as we don't tend to do that anymore, Dixon's letter could have been written yesterday, because what we see overall is a version of a discussion that recurs with every new creative technology. He asks all the questions that go hand in hand with the transition from the old to the new, as he understood that what he did was new. He says, "I want one copyright for all." He is probing here for the scope of his protection, questioning what he actually owns. He is also questioning the significance of employment and attribution. The reason why he's writing you is because he wants to create a rubber stamp with which he can brand the kinetoscopic strips. He uses the name of his employer Edison in the titles, but the name of the copyright is his own. And he's also questioning what the limit is of mechanical reproduction. He says, "I am daily taking new objects, but always with the same machine and the same format and at the same speed." And we are currently living through a version of all of these questions with something we now call artificial intelligence. We don't have any of your answers. So what exactly came in on the 16th of August, perhaps we will never know. But if it had been a photograph, you would have called it that instead of book or form. It was very likely some sort of description of the scheme Dixon thinks he had invented. Perhaps you asked him to send in additional material. Send me a sample. Book or form was clearly not a category, but a sort of inter-office annotation of copyrightable subject matter, some sort of shorthand for does he or does he not, to be determined later. The one other occasion of book or form that I saw, I could not link to a definitive registration. So that likely meant it remained unfinished business. Perhaps they did not have copyrightable material. The fact that you told the Secretary of Treasury a few days after the deposit of the 6th of October came in that the registration was for a photograph shows that you think Dixon did. These 5 really signified a transition. This is the shadow line, Ainsworth. The shadow line between a still picture photographer and a motion picture photographer, between chronophotography and cinematography, and between a toy and an industry. William Gilmore, Edison's new business manager, understood this. He couldn't let Dixon keep these copyrights, and in August 1894, Dixon was forced to assign his kinetoscopic copyrights up till then back to Edison. When in November he then registered the Corbett-Courtney fight, the name Edison is gone from the title, which then also focused on the camera that Dixon developed for Edison. We don't know where this could have gone, as the tension between Gilmore and Dixon became so large that Dixon quit in April 1895. We do know that a renewed version of that camera became the later focus of competition between these men. But that is for some other time. For now, though, you know what is wild, Ainsworth? That US copyright history, US film history, and the Library of Congress's institutional history are solidly and inextricably linked, and that you were in the middle of it all. And I wonder if you even knew. The old makes way for the new, Ainsworth, both in life and in copyright. Works end up in the library because of copyright, and when the rights expire, they can freely live on. They give us insights into the world of the past, but are also the ingredients for new art. That's how culture works, the public domain as a birthplace for creativity. Questioning existing stories and rewriting them for their complexity and different meanings they've accrued over time is important, perhaps especially when the works are in the public domain. And that's why this collection of materials is a repository of indeterminate potential. And while these archival holdings are being kept cool and dry, daily life must also continue. I'd like to invite you into my DeLorean time machine and come with me for a second, so I can show you some things you certainly will never have seen. You spend about an hour a day in the saddle, and sometimes even came to the library on horse. Today the city has what I guess we could call electric horses. A few years before you died, a couple of brothers were able to leave the ground in an airplane for the first time. And look at this, Washington from the air today. It's pretty magical. Technology, Ainsworth, it lets you transport virtually these days. I went to see this exhibition by one of my fellow countrymen and one of your contemporaries. Those goggles allow these children to spend an afternoon in Vincent's life in the south of France while sitting in DC. And I have no idea how to explain this to you. And then there is transportation of another kind. A few years after you died, in 1912, the mayor of Tokyo gifted DC 3,000 cherry blossom trees, which seemed to miraculously light up the city for about 5 days in spring. One of them adorns the southeast corner of the Jefferson Building, incidentally the corner of the building where the mail receiving room of the Copyright Office was located. I don't know of a more beautiful symbol of the evanescence of life and the rebirth of it than this tree. And in ideal synchronicity, I think you would like seeing that Edison also had a Japanese tree in his garden. There was a rumor of an inaugural ball after the Jefferson Building opened, although I've never seen pictures. I can only imagine that this song by one of your other contemporaries was playing while you waltzed your way through the Great Hall as a dapper 72-year-old. Originally composed by a foreigner in 1866 and therefore never protected in the US, I can now share this version on the internet. I might have to explain the internet to you in a separate video, but needless to tell you, copyright has even shaped the way I have been able to tell this story about you handling copyright. This song was made very famous by an American filmmaker some 60 years after you died. When I first saw that scene, which lasts a whooping 5 minutes, and if you didn't recognize it, Ainsworth, that was outer space. It transported me to a different world. Back on Earth here in DC though, I am very happy to tell you that today we are still dancing in the Great Hall. I am at the end of my story, Ainsworth, and I have my own shadow line to face. The research is never finished, so when do I know that I have looked long and hard enough? There are many issues left to explore, like what were you trying to do? Rather than seeing Dixon's letter as a confusion between patent and copyright law, which I believe both of you understood, I think you were trying to register a series, variations on the same thing. That certainly would explain the similarity of the individual titles. And what did different photos or unalike mean? Looking at some of the much later deposits by Dixon when he ran his own company, we see something interesting in the unalikeness of those deposits. He was supposed to deposit 2 best edition copies of the work, and he was a photographer. It obviously would have been easier to just print 2 of the same images. But he seems to be thinking in the plural again, as if the concept of motion pictures only exists in the relationship between these 2 images. The legal conceptualization of motion pictures is a fascinating story, full of shadow lines, full of people taking decisions, and full of archival absences. The librarian who holds your job today, and guess what, Ainsworth? She's a woman. In fact, both the librarian and the Register of Copyrights are women. She has announced that she wants to throw open the so-called treasure chest. Just like many other films I have quoted in this video, The Blacksmith Shop is already part of the National Film Registry, a list of films selected annually for their significance. But now that we know what we're looking for, perhaps she can send some people into that treasure chest and try to locate the deposit materials for the film. Those are still missing. If this is the history of the victors, and we can only tell it this partially, then where does that leave everybody else? One of the 3 guys in the blacksmith shop allegedly is John Ott, Fred's brother, and I can only imagine that in the future they will hang on this wall together. I guess the movies were right all along. At times, I thought this project was going to end like Raiders of the Lost Ark, but it has actually turned out to be more like The Last Crusade, in which both a prize and illumination were possible. And who knows, perhaps as more material becomes available, I will check in with you again in a few years. In the meantime, I salute you, Ainsworth. Seeing your influence all over these buildings and knowing that whenever I meet someone in it who doesn't only have a great memory, but is willing to share their knowledge and help me research the things that I am curious about with a healthy dose of enthusiasm, they are standing on your shoulders. you.